Hi everybody! This video discusses some basic vocabulary that we'll be using when we discuss graphic novels in English 330. Before we talk about the vocabulary, however, we need to spend a little bit of time talking about graphic novels themselves. Graphic novels are a form of sequential art. The comic artist Will Eisner defines sequential art as art forms that use images put in a specific order for the purpose of telling a story. Some common examples of sequential art that you're probably familiar with are things like comics. The term graphic novel is usually used to describe a longer work of sequential art, so something longer than your typical comic. When we read graphic novels, we pay attention to many of the same elements that we pay attention to when reading traditional novels. Things like narration, characterization, and themes. However, we also need to pay attention to the graphic elements of the work. This means things like the arrangement of the images themselves, and the interaction between the images and the text. And if we're going to talk about the graphic elements of graphic novels, we need to have a shared vocabulary that we can use to talk about that. Some of the terms that I'll be talking about in this video are the terms panel, gutter, speech bubble, caption, and splash. And these are just some of the terms that people who study and write graphic novels use to talk about them. So these are some pretty basic terms, but hopefully these will provide a foundation for some of our discussions of the graphic novel that we're reading in this class. So the first term I'm going to talk about is panel. A panel is an image that contains one segment of action, and panels are usually, but not always, surrounded by a border. So in this example comic that I have on this slide, there are 6 different panels. The first panel has 2 people, a male figure and a female figure. The female figure is saying, "I wish I could give you the key to my heart." The second panel has the same male and female figure. And the male figure says, "Well, the switch to your pacemaker is just as good." The third panel has the same 2 figures, and in this one, the male is looking down at something in his hand, and there's a sound effect that says beep. And the fourth one, we have the same 2 figures, but in this one, the male figure is looking down, the female figure is on the ground, and there's the word thud, which indicates that she's fallen, and there's a noise, thud. And the fifth one, we have the same 2 figures. The male figure is still looking at her, and she's still on the ground. And then in the 6th panel, we have this sort of brightly colored background with streaks. We have the male figure jumping up and down saying, "Insurance, hooray!" and the female figure on the ground still. So 6 different panels that, when put together, convey a story. The next term I'm going to talk about is a gutter. So the gutter is the space in between panels. Sometimes it's a simple border, like in the panel that or in the comic that we just talked about. Sometimes there's more of a space between those as well. And when you're reading a comic, readers must use their imagination to sort of fill in what happens in this sort of in-between space between the different panels. So in the example comic that I just went over, you have to sort of use your imagination to fill in what's happening, especially, say, in between the third panel, where you have the male figure holding something in his hand and the sound effect beep, and the woman standing, and then in the 4th panel, where you have the woman on the ground, the noise thud, and the male looking at her. As viewers, as readers, we have to sort of intuit that in between that 3rd panel and that 4th panel, the female basically fell over and the noise thud occurred. Because we don't actually see it happen, we have to fill in those gaps ourselves as readers. Another important sort of convention or technique that's used in comics and sequential art and graphic novels is the speech bubble. Speech bubbles are the frames around character speech. These indicate what a character is saying within the frame. And as you probably know, as you've probably experienced, the shape of the bubble conveys meaning as well. So a cloud, rather than just sort of a simple bubble, usually indicates that the character is thinking the text and not speaking it. Sometimes these are described as thought bubbles. And spiked balloons often indicate that a character is shouting rather than just speaking normally. So in this example comic from Calvin and Hobbes, we see two of these different kinds of speech bubbles being used. In the first one, we see Calvin, who's the kid, on a school bus with a thought bubble that has a picture of him with a propeller beanie. So he's imagining himself wearing this propeller beanie. In the second one, we see him at a school desk, and he still has this thought bubble with a picture of him wearing this propeller beanie. So as we look at this, we can this conveys that Calvin is still imagining himself wearing this propeller beanie hat. In the third one, we see Calvin racing off of the school bus, and he still has this sort of thought bubble or the speech bubble that's in the shape of a cloud with the image of him wearing the propeller beanie in it. So he's still imagining himself wearing it. And then in the fourth panel, we see him and his mom talking. So he races into the room and he says, Mom, did my beanie come in the mail? And his mother says, are you kidding? I just mailed your order this morning. So we have a different shape of speech bubble here, just the regular bubbles, and so that indicates that the two characters are speaking these words. And in the very last panel, we see Calvin sort of slinking away, and he says, I'm never going to make it 6 weeks. And in this one, we don't have the actual bubble around his speech, but we have the line that basically tells us that this is what he's saying. So 2, if not 3, different kinds of speech bubbles that help us to understand sometimes this is what a character is thinking, and then sometimes this is what a character is saying. Another kind of text that we often see in comics and in graphic novels is a caption. So a caption is a text in a box that's separated from the rest of the panel or the page. So unlike a thought bubble or a speech bubble, it's in a box and is not necessarily something within the comic themselves. So it's not something that a figure within the comic is saying or thinking. It usually indicates a narrator's voice as opposed to a character's voice, but they can also indicate other voices. So the example on this slide is one panel from a X-Men comic. And in this comic, in the image anyway, we see Professor X sitting in a chair. And at the top of the panel, we have this caption, so this text that's in a box, and this is the narrator telling us what's happening within this panel. So the narrator says, finally, his meditation comes to an end. Then, while he remains completely motionless, a sharp commanding thought rings out, echoing through the great halls of the building. So this caption gives us the narrator conveying what's happening. And then underneath that, we have 2 thought bubbles that tell us what Professor X is thinking. So the first thought bubble says, attention X-Men, this is Professor Xavier calling. Repeat, this is Professor X calling. And then the second thought bubble says, you are ordered to appear at once. Class is now in session. Tardiness will be punished. So again, we have 2 different examples of text within a panel. We have the caption, which is the narrator, and then we have the thought bubbles, which tell us what a character is thinking. And then the last term that I'm going to talk about is splash. So a splash is a large panel that spans an entire page, and sometimes it can even span 2 entire pages. So whereas most comics or graphic novels are made up of multiple small panels all put together, a splash is one big panel that takes up 1 or 2 pages. They're often used at the beginning of novels or individual chapters to set the tone and introduce themes. But they're not always. Sometimes they can be situated anywhere within a graphic novel or a comic, depending on what the artist and the writer are trying to do. So the example that I have here is the very first panel of American-Born Chinese, which is the graphic novel we're reading for this class. And this is one big panel that takes up the whole first page of the graphic novel. And we have a caption in the top left corner that says, "One bright and starry night, the gods, the goddesses, the demons, and the spirits gathered in heaven for a dinner party." So this sets the tone as sort of the narrator telling us what's happening. And then we see in the image multiple different figures, some of which look like people, some of which look less like people. They have funny colored skin or weird facial features, eating and engaged in conversation. And then we see that some of these people are talking to one another, and we see that because they're speech bubbles. So on the right-hand side, we see two figures, an old man and a young woman, talking to each other. And so the old man in the speech bubble says, "Your peaches are looking especially plump today, my dear." And then on the right-hand side, we see the younger female saying, "Tihi ostapa lauzu." And then at the bottom, we see another figure who sort of has like a bird-like face saying, "I don't mean to boast, but the thunderstorm I put together last night impressed even myself." So there's a lot going on in this image, and it sort of conveys what's happening at this dinner party. And it's at the beginning of the chapter, so it helps set the tone for that chapter and introduces sort of the world of at least this first chapter in American-Born Chinese. So that's the end of this video. Like I said earlier, this is just some basic vocabulary that we can use as we talk about what's happening in comics and in the graphic novels and in the specific different parts of the graphic novels that we're talking about. So I hope you found this helpful, and we can use this as we begin to talk about the graphic novel American-Born Chinese.